You ever hear a story so wild that it sticks with you, even when you're dead set on not believing it? That's what happened to me, Nick Peterson, a park ranger by trade out of Miami. I didn't think the things I'd read about as a kid or the creepy campfire tales had a shred of truth to them. But then there was this one time, just last winter, out in the rainy woods of Bladenboro, North Carolina, where I swear to you something unexplainable happened. I'd taken a trip with three buddies, Ryan, Jose and Mike. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, just a day hike through the woods. We had all been itching to escape the grind and get a breath of fresh air. I'd chosen Bladenboro because of the trails. They were supposed to be scenic but quiet, far from the touristy routes. I'll admit though, the place had a reputation. Folks around there talked about strange sightings, a dogman, ghosts, even skinwalkers. I'd laughed it off, but Ryan had to bring up how he'd seen a game about skinwalkers once. The lore, the shape-shifting, the mimicking voices, it all sounded like good campfire material to me, but that was all it was, or so I thought. We set out in the late morning. The rain had started early that day, a steady drizzle that made everything slick and muddy. The air had that damp chill that creeps under your clothes, but the forest was beautiful in its own way. Grey skies peeking through the skeletal trees, the faint rustle of wind in the branches. We were about 2 hours in when I noticed something odd. The forest felt wrong. Now, as a ranger, I spent my fair share of time outdoors. You get a feel for the woods, for the life that moves around you, the chirping of birds, the rustle of small animals, even the hum of insects. But this place, it was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels darting through the underbrush, just the sound of the rain tapping against the leaves and our boots squelching in the mud. Jose was the first to call it out. "Hey, you guys hear that?" "Hear what?" Mike asked, his voice laced with tension. Jose tilted his head, listening. "I don't know, something like footsteps." We all paused, straining our ears. At first there was nothing but the rain. Then faintly I heard it, crunch, crunch, like someone or something stepping on wet leaves a few yards away. Ryan chuckled nervously. "Probably just an animal, a deer or something." "Deer don't move like that," I muttered, tightening my grip on the hiking stick I was carrying. The sound stopped when we stopped, and when we moved, it followed, always keeping its distance, but close enough that we couldn't ignore it. We were all spooked, but we pressed on, hoping to shrug it off. It wasn't until we came to a clearing that things took a turn for the worse. Ryan froze mid-step, pointing ahead. "What the hell is that?" At the far end of the clearing, just barely visible through the mist and rain, was a figure. It stood hunched, its shape distorted and unnatural. At first, I thought it might be a person, a local, maybe. But then it shifted, and the way it moved wasn't human. It was jerky, almost insect-like. As it leaned forward, sniffing the air, Jose cursed under his breath. "We should go back. Now." I nodded, but before we could turn, it let out this sound, a low guttural growl that made my blood run cold. And then it spoke. "Help me." The voice was warped, like someone trying to mimic speech but not quite getting it right. It was eerie enough to freeze us all in place. "Did that thing just talk?" Mike whispered, his voice shaking. I nodded slowly, my mind racing. Skinwalker. That's what it had to be. The mimicry, the stalking, it all fit the stories I'd heard, the game Ryan had told about. The creature took a step forward, and that was all it took to snap us out of our daze. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted back the way we'd come. The next hour was a blur of adrenaline and terror. The thing didn't give up. It stalked us, its guttural growls echoing through the trees. At one point, it mimicked Ryan's voice, crying out, "Wait, don't leave me." We knew better than to stop, but panic was setting in. Jose tripped and twisted his ankle, forcing us to slow down. We had a couple of hunting knives between us, but against whatever that thing was, they felt like toys. We made it to a narrow gorge, the only way across being a fallen tree acting as a bridge. I went first, helping Jose limp across. Ryan and Mike followed, but as soon as we were all on the other side, the creature emerged from the shadows. It was close now, and I could see it clearly. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, glowing faintly in the dim light, and its mouth, it was too wide, filled with jagged teeth. It let out an unearthly screech and lunged at us. Ryan swung at it with his knife, catching it across the arm, but it didn't even flinch. Mike grabbed a large branch and swung it like a bat, hitting it square in the chest. That seemed to slow it down, but not for long. "Keep moving," I yelled, shoving Jose ahead. We ran until we saw the road through the trees. A car was coming, a pickup truck, its headlights cutting through the rain. I waved my arms, shouting, and the truck skidded to a stop. The driver, an older man in flannel shirt, threw open the door. "What's going on?" "No time," I shouted, helping Jose into the back. "Drive." He didn't ask any more questions, just floored it. As we sped away, I looked back and saw the creature standing at the edge of the trees, its hollow eyes watching us. We didn't stop until we were miles away. The driver dropped us off at a diner, and we sat there in silence, trying to process what had happened. To this day, I can't explain what we saw out there, but I know one thing: it wasn't human. And if you're ever hiking in Bladenboro, keep your ears open. You never know what might be watching. Welcome everyone. I hope you enjoy Skinwalker stories, because this is the theme of this episode. Enjoy the stories, and now let's move to the second one. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you wish you could just hit undo? That's exactly how I felt that spring day in Arizona wilderness. My name's George Cage, born and raised in Miami, working in IT now, and living what most people would call an ordinary life. Fishing's my way to escape the screens and cables. But this time, instead of sitting by a quiet lake, I let my buddies talk me into something a little more adventurous. A hunting trip, they said. Out in the wild, clear skies, good company. What could go wrong? There were 4 of us: me, Sam, Greg, and Mike. We'd known each other for years, but this was the first time we decided to try out hands at hunting. Arizona seemed like the perfect spot, with its open landscapes and sparse crowds. It was sunny, warm, and the kind of place you'd only think good memories would be made. Before we left, Sam brought up something that stuck with me. "Ever heard of skinwalkers?" he asked casually, leaning on the bed of his truck as we packed. I shrugged. "Yeah, sort of. Aren't they part of some Navajo legend or something? Shapeshifters?" Sam nodded. "They can mimic voices too. Creepy stuff. My cousin swears he saw one once near Flagstaff." We all laughed it off. I mean, legends are legends, right? But as we drove deeper into the wilderness, something about that conversation clung to the back of my mind, like a splinter you can't quite reach. The day started off great. We set up camp near a cluster of trees on a ridge overlooking the desert. The sun was bright, the air warm, and the scenery breathtaking. We grabbed off rifles, loaded up on water, and set off into the scrubby wilderness, joking and teasing each other as we went. Around mid-afternoon, things started to feel off. Greg, the most experienced outdoorsman amongst us, paused suddenly and scanned the trees ahead. "What is it?" I asked. "Nothing," he said after a moment, though his tone didn't sound convinced. "Thought I saw something move, that's all." We continued on, but the laughter and chatter faded. The woods were unnervingly quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our boots crunching against the dry ground. It was Sam who spotted it first. "Guys, over there," he whispered, pointing to a tree about 20 yards away. We followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. A figure crouched behind the trunk, half hidden in shadow. It wasn't moving, just staring, its eyes gleaming unnaturally in the sunlight, like a predator's. "Is that a person?" Mike muttered, gripping his rifle tighter. "Hey," Greg called. "You lost or something?" The figure didn't respond. It just stayed there, motionless, staring at us. "Let's go," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. "We'll circle back to camp." Nobody argued. We moved quickly but cautiously, keeping an eye on the tree. By the time we looked back, the figure was gone. When we got back to camp, the atmosphere was tense. Mike tried to lighten the mood by cracking a joke, but it fell flat. We all knew what we'd seen wasn't normal. As night fell, the unease deepened. We lit a fire and sat around it, our rifles within arm's reach. Every now and then, one of us would glance toward the trees, half expecting to see those eyes again. Around midnight, we heard it, a voice, faint and distant, calling out from the darkness. "Help me." It sounded like Greg. "Greg?" Sam whispered, his eyes wide. "I'm right here," Greg said, his voice shaking. The voice called out again, closer this time. "Help me." It wasn't just mimicking Greg's voice, it was distorting it, twisting it into something unnatural. Sam grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed shifting shadows and swaying branches. Then it came, a screech so loud and piercing it made my ears ring. The figure from earlier burst from the trees, moving faster than anything I've seen. It was taller now, its limbs elongated and grotesque. Its face was a nightmare, human-like, but wrong. The features stretched and warped. "Shoot it," Greg shouted, raising his rifle. We all opened fire, the deafening cracks of our guns echoing through the night. The creature flinched, but it didn't stop. It lunged at Sam, knocking him to the ground with a sickening thud. I grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it at the creature, hitting it square in the side. It let out another screech and retreated into the shadows. But I knew it wasn't gone. "We need to move," I yelled, helping Sam to his feet. Leaving most of our gear behind, we bolted toward the nearest town, which was miles away. The creature stalked us the whole way, its guttural growls and distorted mimicry haunting us. At one point, it called out in my voice, "Wait for me." We didn't stop until we reached the outskirts of a small town. A gas station attendant saw us stumbling out of the woods, battered and terrified, and called the police. When they arrived, we told them everything, but they didn't believe us. They chalked it up to a wild animal encounter or dehydration. But I know what we saw. Skinwalkers are real, and if you are ever out in Arizona wilderness, keep your wits about you. Some legends aren't just stories. Alright, let me tell you a story I've never shared before. Not in full anyway. It's one of those things that even years later feels like it shouldn't have happened, but it did. And if you've got the time, I'll walk you through it. It was winter when this all went down. Though in the Blue Mountains, winter doesn't always mean snow and ice. The days were sunny, the air crisp, and everything looked like it came straight out of a nature calendar. That's why we went there in the first place. Me and my three buddies, Eric, Danny, and Rachel. I'm Sam Davidson, by the way. I'm a cook back in Los Angeles, but hiking and camping trips like this, they've always been my way of decompressing from the chaos of the kitchen. Now, I'd heard stories about the Blue Mountains, not the usual wildlife stuff, bears, coyotes, all that, but about skinwalkers, shape-shifting creatures from Navajo legend. My cousin used to tell me about them, when we were kids, how they could mimic voices to lure people out into the woods. I'd always brushed it off as campfire nonsense, the kind of thing meant to spook kids into behaving. But as we drove deeper into the mountains, that old story started creeping back into my head. We set up camp in a clearing surrounded by tall pines and a rocky outcrop on the side. The place felt remote, untouched, perfect for what we had in mind. 2 days of hiking, a night under the stars, and plenty of laughs around the fire. The first day went off without a hitch. We hiked to a nearby lookout, snapped a ton of photos, and even spotted a couple of deer grazing in the distance. By the time we got back to camp, the sun was setting and we were starving. I whipped up some foil-wrapped meals over the fire, nothing fancy, but it hit the spot. That night, as we were sitting around the fire, Eric brought up the stories. "Ever heard of skinwalkers?" he asked, poking at the fire with a stick. Rachel rolled her eyes. "Oh, here we go." "I'm serious," Eric insisted. "They're real. My uncle swears he saw one when he was hunting in Utah. Said it sounded just like his friend calling for help, but his friend was back at the camp the whole time." Danny laughed. "And I'm sure his uncle wasn't just drunk, right?" "Laugh all you want," Eric said. "But if you hear something out there tonight, don't go running toward it." We all chuckled nervously, but deep down, I could tell the story had gotten to us, me included. Around midnight, we called it a night and retreated to our tents. I was just starting to doze off when I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving through the brush. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then it happened again, closer this time. I unzipped my tent and peeked out. The fire was still smoldering, casting a dim glow over the camp. Everything looked normal, but the sound persisted, soft, deliberate, and circling us. "Eric," I whispered, hoping he was still awake. No answer. Then clear as day, I heard Danny's voice. "Hey Sam, come here for a second." But it wasn't coming from Danny's tent, it was coming from the trees. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might wake everyone up. "Danny," I called out, my voice trembling. "What?" Danny's groggy voice came from his tent, nowhere near the trees. That's when I knew. Something was out there, and it wasn't human. "Wake up," I hissed, unzipping Danny's tent and shaking him awake. "There's something out there." By the time everyone was up and armed with whatever we could find, knives, a hatchet, even a hiking pole, the sounds had stopped. We stood in a tight circle, flashlight scanning the trees, but there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the woods at night. The next day, we decided to cut the trip short. As much as we tried to laugh it off over breakfast, none of us wanted to spend another night out there. We packed up camp and started the hike back to the car. But the thing about the wilderness is that it doesn't let you leave on your own terms. About an hour into the hike, Rachel stopped dead in her tracks. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We all fell silent, then we heard it, a low guttural growl, followed by a voice. "Help me." It sounded like Rachel, but distorted, broken. Before any of us could react, the thing stepped out from behind a tree. It was tall, gaunt, and twisted, with limbs too long for its body, and a face that seemed to shift and blur when we tried to focus on it. "Run!" Eric shouted, and we bolted. The creature didn't chase us immediately. It toyed with us, mimicking our voices, calling out from different directions. It wanted us to split up, but we stuck together, stumbling over roots and rocks in our panic. Finally, it came for us. It lunged at Danny, knocking him to the ground. I swung the hiking pole as hard as I could, hitting it square in the face. It let out a screech that made my ears ring, but it didn't back down. Rachel grabbed the hatchet and swung it wildly. driving the creature back long enough for us to pull Danny to his feet. We ran like hell, not stopping until we reached the parking lot where our car was waiting. We piled in, slammed the doors, and peeled out of there, not looking back until we hit the main road. To this day, I don't know what that thing was. A skinwalker? Maybe. All I know is that it wasn't human, and it wanted us dead. So if you ever find yourself in the Blue Mountains and hear a voice calling your name, do yourself a favor. Don't answer. Just run. Do you ever feel like you walked out of one world and straight into another? Like you're not supposed to be there, where you are, and the air itself is telling you to turn back? That's how it felt for me that weekend in the Pacific Northwest. I still don't have an explanation for what happened, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back there again. It was autumn, a calm, crisp kind of season, the kind where you feel like the forest is alive, but not in a threatening way. I was with a group of friends, Tyler, Jenna, Marcus, and my dog, Boomer. Boomer was a mutt, the kind of dog you'd pick up at a shelter and wonder why no one else saw how perfect he was. He had this instinct for sniffing out danger, which, as it turns out, was both a blessing and a curse. We'd rented a cabin deep in the woods for a long weekend. Tyler had found a place online, and it looked like something out of a postcard. Big wraparound porch, wood-burning stove, and surrounded by towering evergreens. It was supposed to be a chill few days of fishing, hiking, and doing absolutely nothing. When we got there, everything seemed normal. The cabin was cozy, the forest was serene, and Boomer was loving it, bounding around like he'd never been outside a day in his life. We unpacked, cracked open a few beers, and spent the first day just soaking it all in. That night though, things started to feel off. We were sitting around the fireplace laughing about something stupid Marcus had said, when Boomer's ears perked up. He let out this low growl, the kind that rumbles deep in his chest. "What is it, boy?" I asked, scratching behind his ears. He didn't move, just kept staring at the window. Jenna looked over her shoulder. Probably just a raccoon or something. But it wasn't just a raccoon. The feeling hit me then, like a pressure in the air, like we were being watched. Boomer barked once, sharp and loud, then ran to the door, scratching at it like he wanted out. Tyler grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. "Alright, let's see what's out there." We all followed him onto the porch, shivering in the cold night air. The forest was silent, too silent, not even the rustle of leaves or the call of an owl. Just this oppressive stillness. "I don't see anything," Tyler said, sweeping the flashlight across the trees. But Boomer was growling again, his eyes locked on something just beyond the tree line. I squinted, trying to see what he was so worked up about. And then I saw it. Movement. At first, I thought it was a shadow, but it wasn't. It was something big, hunched over, moving too smoothly for any animal I'd ever seen. "What the hell is that?" Jenna whispered. None of us answered. We stood there for what felt like forever, watching as this thing moved between the trees. It didn't come closer, just stayed on the edge of the forest, almost like it was studying us. Eventually, we went back inside, locking the door and bolting every window. I didn't sleep that night, and I don't think anyone else did either. The next day, we decided to stay close to the cabin. The plan was to leave early the following morning, but something about the forest didn't feel right anymore. Boomer wouldn't stop pacing, and every so often he'd growl at the windows. We tried to laugh it off, but the tension was thick. Around midday, Marcus and I went to chop some firewood, while Jenna and Tyler stayed inside. We were about halfway through when Boomer started barking like crazy. "What now?" Marcus muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. I turned, and there it was. The thing from the night before was back, but this time it wasn't hiding. It stood about 50 yards away, half concealed by a tree. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs were all wrong, long and twisted like branches. "Marcus," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He turned and froze. The creature stepped out from behind the tree, and that's when I noticed its face, or lack of one. It was like looking at a blurred photograph, features shifting and melting together. Then it spoke. "Dean." My blood ran cold. It was my voice. "Dean," it said again, mimicking me perfectly, but with this guttural undertone that made my stomach churn. "Run," I shouted, grabbing Boomer's collar and pulling him toward the cabin. Marcus was right behind me, and we burst through the door, slamming it shut just as the thing let out a bone-chilling screech. "What happened?" Jenna asked, but we didn't have time to explain. The next few hours were a blur. The creature circled the cabin, scratching at its walls, tapping on the windows. At one point, it mimicked Jenna's voice, calling out for help. By the time night fell, we were running on pure adrenaline. We knew we couldn't stay there, but leaving felt just as dangerous. Eventually, we made a plan. There was a main road about 2 miles from the cabin. If we could make it there, we'd be safe, or at least safer. We armed ourselves with whatever we could find: kitchen knives, a hatchet, even a fireplace poker, and made a break for it. The forest was a nightmare. Every shadow felt alive, every sound sent my heart racing. Boomer stayed close, his hackles raised, growling at nothing and everything. The creature didn't attack outright, it toyed with us, snapping branches, mimicking our voices, and letting out these horrible, inhuman cries. Finally, we saw the road through the trees. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The creature was behind us, faster than anything I've seen. It lunged at Tyler, knocking him to the ground, but Boomer was on it in a flash, barking and snapping. I grabbed the hatchet and swung with everything I had, hitting it square in the shoulder. It screeched and recoiled, giving us just enough time to pull Tyler up and make a run for it. We stumbled onto the road, waving down the first car we saw. The driver, an older guy in a pickup, didn't ask questions. He just let us pile in and sped off. We didn't look back. To this day, I don't know what that thing was. I didn't grow up hearing stories about skinwalkers or anything like that, but I've done some reading since. Whatever it wasn't natural. So, if you're ever out in the Pacific Northwest and you feel like you're being watched, trust your gut. And if you hear your own voice calling from the trees, run. Thank you everyone for listening to the stories and being here with me. I wish you all the best and have a good night.